Welcome back to Prof E Plays. I'm Prof E, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this idea that I presented. Interestingly, I presented it with trying to solve a specific problem before I presented the underlying idea. But yeah, we always do things out of order here on Prof E Plays. So I want to talk about the RPG mental triangle, which is an idea that I developed based on the old GNS theory. So let's get into that, and I want to describe kind of what this is, what this video is going to be about. So, I want to first present what this RPG mental triangle is, and specifically the elements of story, system, and immersion. I want to talk about each of these three elements and then share some thoughts on kind of how we can balance them strategically, specifically in the context of a solo RPG. Although certainly I think all three of these elements exist in any tabletop RPG. Actually, probably any RPG, including like on a computer or something like that. I think all of these elements are there. Uh, just it's approached differently when it's, I guess, technologically mediated. We'll just say it that way. But I specifically want to think in terms of like a tabletop role-playing game, sitting down at the table, rolling dice, that kind of thing, and especially doing it solo, being most of what I do. So let's go ahead and take a look at what I mean. Right, so here's the RPG mental triangle. So the idea of the mental triangle is that there are these three different mental processes that we have to pull from. Right, so we have story, we have system, and we have immersion. Now you can see in the triangle that I have here that I put story at the top. There's no particular reason for that. This is not a hierarchy or anything like that. It isn't like story is built on system and immersion or anything like that. Rather, the point of the triangle is that when you play a game, the way that you are operating in terms of your mental space and where you live in terms of the game is going to be somewhere inside this triangle. And what that means, right, is that for you to spend more mental time on any one of these three elements, you have to spend less mental time on one of the other two elements. Now, there are some moves you can make that will say, allow you to say, get more story without sacrificing immersion. But if you do that, you have to sacrifice system time, right? Or you can get more immersion without sacrificing story. But again, to do that, you have to sacrifice system time. Or you can get more system time, but to do that, you have to sacrifice either immersion or story, right? So each of these three elements requires different things from us mentally. And therefore, the more we do one, the less we can do any other. So let's talk about each of these elements and what I mean by them, so that then we can see why they would be, in some sense, incompatible in terms of our mental space, which necessitates the trade-off. So first, I'll start with story. Again, I just put it at the top of the triangle, so this is kind of accidental that this happened this way. Right, so what I mean by a story is there being a recognizable narrative arc. Now, often we'll think in terms of a three-act structure just because this is the kind of thing that we're taught, say, in middle school when we're taught about how stories work, right? So you have some kind of introduction or inciting incident that gets the ball rolling. Then you have this rising action you go through till you hit the climax, and then we make our way down, right, to a resolution. And so this is the process that we go through. Right? So what story requires then is mentally for us to think about the fact that we have an inciting incident, that we have rising action, and that we eventually end up, right, with climax and resolution. And so it requires a certain intentionality to get that. Now, I will say that story includes other things as well, right? So it's not just this pattern of the course of the story, the narrative arc, but also a number of other elements that come in. So things like having a theme, right, or having characters that are foils for the PCs. These are all elements of narrative which do not necessarily exist in real life. It's a part of something that is fictional, right? But it's something that helps to enrich, right, the story that is being told, right, and the ideas in that story. And so this idea of theme, foil, and structure, all of these are story elements which require some mental space if we want to make sure they appear. Right? So that is one piece. Now, a second piece would be the system. And this is where I'm talking about typically you're rolling the dice. So we're thinking through the rules, the mechanics of the system itself. Right? So things like what should, if you're using a D20 based system, what should the difficulty of a particular task be? What's that target number you're trying to hit? Right? Or if you're using, say, some kind of dice pool system, how many successes are necessary in order to achieve this goal? Right? These types of things. These are questions that have to be asked and answered if you're playing a game. Games are defined in large sense by there being rules that you have to follow, that you as a player, right, are constrained by rules as you're trying to accomplish whatever the objectives are you're trying to accomplish. Right? So the system is really all about what are the mechanical constraints as you're rolling dice or whatever that the system happens to be, whether you're trading in narrative points, whatever it happens to be that you're working with, managing that side of it is another thing that takes mental processes. Now, notably, system mentally is very disconnected from story, which we've already talked about. After all, right, the climax doesn't particularly care, right, what you roll. The climax is there as part of the narrative structure, right? Rolling something or not, I mean, we know that in practice in the game that makes things more or less exciting, right? But nonetheless, there's a disconnect here, right? And certainly when I'm thinking about say what kind of modifiers I apply to my role, that has very little to do with the story. Right? Right. So typically we would not say, oh, because we're moving toward the climax, you get a +3 on this roll. That is not normally what happens, right? So normally there is this big disconnect between story, where we are in that side of things, and the system that we are operating, which is trying to simulate reality much of the time, right? So again, mentally, there's a conflict between these two, or at the very least, an incompatibility in thinking about them both simultaneously. We have to spend time with one, but as we spend time with one, we're sacrificing mental time with the other thing. And then finally, there's immersion. So, immersion, I think one thing that really got me thinking about this more was that I recently learned about this gaming philosophy called 4D, right? So, and it is 4D as in like fourth dimension. So the idea of 4D is that there are kind of four different levels or dimensions at which you can play a role-playing game. The first dimension is a purely social game, so it's really just an excuse to get people over and have some snacks and laugh around a table. And so this first dimension game, you would have, as you're playing, a lot of, say, out of character chatter, that kind of thing. We're just kind of enjoying spending time together. So the game is not really central. What is central is the social time. Right? So in this case, the game is an excuse to get together. That's called 1D. Right? 2D would be where you do take the game somewhat more seriously, but it isn't really a role-playing experience in any kind of strict immersive sense. Instead, it's something like maybe a war game with role-playing elements. Right, so if that's the case, say we break out our grids and our minis, and it's largely a tactical game. Or the other way that 2D can go is that it's story time, right? So we're all getting together, we're telling a story. We're not really worried that much about embodying our characters as we are about creating this narrative arc together. But now we may have more control over one character than others as we play, but really the purpose is not to embody our characters. The third dimension, or 3D, this is be the role player's game. Now here, as players, your goal is to embody your character and play as if you are that character, making the decisions that the character would make. Inside of a 3D game, you stay fairly strictly within character. We don't have out of game chatter. We don't talk that much about system. We try to minimize that as much as possible. Now, the 4D game is the co-creator game. So this is where not only do the players have control over their characters, but they also have a limited control over the world as long as they stay within kind of the conventions of that world. Right, so things like say in a 3D game, the game master decides what it is that is, say, inside of a desk. Right? Are there any pens in there? That kind of thing. Whereas in a 4D game, the players, if it's reasonable, there are probably pens in that desk. They can open the desk and pull out a pen without having to check with the GM to make sure there's a pen there. Right? That's the basic difference here. Now, the 4D folks are really, really into this idea of immersion and that being what role playing is really all about, is trying to embody this character and feel like you are in some kind of simulated reality. Now, this is something that's very mentally demanding, naturally, which means then that if you're really embodying the mind of your character, right, most of us, like when I live my life, I'm not thinking about the fact that, well, where am I in my story? Am I waiting for an inciting incident to happen? Am I responding to that through rising action? Right? Am I perhaps in resolution after a large climax has occurred in my story? No, that's not the way people think about their own lives, right? Which means then, in as far as you are immersed, you're not going to be able to think about these larger narrative arcs. Similarly, when I am thinking about my life, I don't think in mechanical terms most of the time. Things like, oh, well, if I do this, I get a +3 modifier. No, I might think along the lines of, oh, this is something I'm pretty good at, so I'm going to try to do that. But bringing in the technicalities of the system moves you away from that immersive experience, right? So with immersion, I have the picture of it's like you're putting on your character, right? So you're putting on your character the same way that a kid puts on the dinosaur costume and becomes a dinosaur, right? So that is the goal of immersion is to really put on your character and to play as that character and experience the game world through that character's eyes rather than as some kind of mechanical construct or narrative construct. So we then have these three elements. And I hope that it's clear that each of them, right, the more time we spend doing one, the less mental space we have available to do the other two, which is going to create the challenge. That is, there are trade-offs, which means we have to make choices between these three mental spaces, or in our mental space, how we combine these three elements. Now, by nature, I want to suggest that a role-playing game, specifically a tabletop role-playing game, requires a combination of all three of them, right? So it's not so easy for us to just say, well, I'm just going to do this one. Right? Because the reality is, without system, what we're doing isn't really a game anymore. The game requires a rule set. Right? Rules are part of something being a game. If there are no rules, we're not playing a game, we're playing pretend. And there's nothing wrong with playing pretend, but calling that a game is misleading. Or without immersion. In that case, we're not really role playing in the sense of taking on a character. Now, we might be role playing, and I've heard Ben Milton say, well, he likes the idea of role playing as in you have a role you're fulfilling within your party, right? So I am the wizard, I am the thief, that kind of idea, right? But you're missing out on this other definition of role playing that I think has generally been adopted by most people. That when I play this game, I'm not really thinking of, well, this is me, Prof E, I'm just happen to have spells, right? No, instead, I'm trying to take on a different character. Now, that character may reflect large elements of myself. And, I do often use role-playing characters to kind of think about if I enhanced certain characteristics of my own personality, right? So, what if I became, say, extremely strict and ascetic about something, right? Or whatever it happens to be. Right, so I think about these different characteristics of myself and then enhance them to build a character around them so that it's not totally foreign. But nonetheless, I'm trying to play this other character that is not just me with different skills. Right? So without that immersion, right, we're kind of missing out on the role playing part of the role playing game. Now, without story, I think that what we end up finding is that we don't really have a satisfying end. Yes, the session stops at a certain point because we run out of time. Right? But without some kind of sense of we had a beginning, we went through a middle, and then we accomplished some kind of goal, right? Or there was some kind of resolution, whether it was successful or not. Without that narrative arc sense, we tend not to feel like we have a really actually have any kind of satisfying end at all. Right? So for us to really have a role playing game that is satisfying to people, we need each of these elements in some kind of balance. Now, it come some thoughts related to this. One nice thing about playing with solo role playing is that you can try to make room, right, for whatever you want, right? So if you want to have a game that is largely about immersion and story, we can try to minimize the system side and with not eliminate it, but at least cut back on it. So we can choose, say, a system that's fairly light or a system that's very familiar. We could do something like, oh, what is it? The easy D6 system. Right? Very, very simple, right? You just roll one die, it tells you whether you succeeded or failed. Right, very, very quickly, right? Or even something like a very simple oracle. I actually have a video talking about where I give an extremely simple system you can use, and it is effectively like an easy D6 system. Roll a D6 and it tells you whether you succeeded or failed. So we can minimize the amount of mental space that it takes by having an extremely simple system or one that we already know really well. Right? If you don't have to think about it much, it's not going to take up much mental space, leaving plenty of mental space for immersion and story. Or if perhaps what we like, or maybe we don't care so much about immersion. So what we really want is to tell a good story and system. So what we want is kind of, we want to do, sometimes I've heard some solo role players get really defensive about this and say, "Oh, it's not just creative writing with dice." But sometimes that's what you want, right? You want creative writing with dice. That is, you want to tell a story, but you want some randomness in there. The story system combination is perfectly fine, right? And it's actually fairly easy to pull off in the sense of it's easy to give up on immersion, right? So you don't have to worry too much about the immersive details, right? So focus in on kind of what are the key points in terms of the narrative, right? And use the system to resolve those key points. This is something we can do, saving the mental space, right, for the story and system by not worrying too much about the immersive aspects of it. Or maybe we want a game that emphasizes more the immersion in the system. Well, in this case, again, this is something that, again, fairly easily we can make this adjustment and just say, well, I'm not going to worry that much about narrative flow, reaching a climax, or any of this kind of stuff. Or I'm not going to worry about whether there's a theme going on here. I'm not going to worry about establishing, say, character foils and these kinds of things. Instead, what I'm going to do is live out my simulated character in the simulated reality using the system. That's perfectly fine. You don't have to worry about there being some kind of character arc. You don't have to do that. Right? So I think that so any of these combinations we can do, and you can lighten up right any one of the elements as you wish. Like I find like for myself, and there are some cases where you can actually go pretty pure in one of these, right? So can you have a pure story game? Well, yes. Now that would just be creative writing without dice. Right? But this is an experience. If you want that, you can create it. Similarly, you can create a an experience that's basically pure system. This is the way that I play D100 Dungeon. Right? So D100 Dungeon, a very cool system. It is all about resource management and this kind of thing. Now, if you want to, you can try to overlap a story over top of it. You can kind of flesh out the reason that you're there and all of that, accomplishing this quest. I don't really want to do that. When I sit down to play D100 Dungeon, I'm not feeling that creative. I just kind of want to work through the mechanics of the game and make strategic choices. That's it. Again, there are options available for that. Similarly, if you just want pure immersion, you don't have to have a system, you don't have to have a story, right? You can just play pretend in your head, right? Or you can just kind of journal as your character. There's nothing wrong with doing this. Right? Now, if you want it to be a role-playing game, right, then I think that most of us would feel like we're missing something if we don't at least have all three elements in some fashion. But even if you have all three elements, you don't have to give them equal time. You can focus on those elements that you prefer to have and minimize the elements you would. Okay. So, some kind of closing thoughts, I suppose, from me. Uh, some thoughts on solo RPG and the triangle as well. And here I already mentioned, like any of the pure forms are in some sense easy, but not much of an RPG. So to capture the feel of an RPG, we do want all three of those elements in some kind of balance. So here's kind of just experimental thoughts about how we might be able to accomplish this. So let's say, right, we want to have a game with a good amount of immersion, with a reasonable story as well. We want there to be a recognizable beginning, middle, and end in terms of there being a structure. But at the same time, there needs to be enough system in it, right, to make it a game. Now, I do want to say before I talk about my experiment design here, I don't think I'm the right necessarily the most qualified person for this. I think that there are other solo RPGers that if you go and you just watch what they do, you can see them doing this kind of thing remarkably well. I don't really even have to give names, right? But like, if you can, say, watch a season of Me, Myself, and Die, or The Bad Spot, say, and not recognize that these people are really, really good at balancing these elements of immersion, story, and system, I don't. I I can't, I have nothing to say to you. They're obviously very good at kind of naturally doing this. Now, one thing though that I think is lacking, and I've actually thought about going back and rewatching some of Me, Myself, and Die's stuff, and sitting down taking notes. Like, okay, when is he appealing to system? When is he just kind of filling in the gaps more immersively and thinking through kind of what would his character see his character's eyes, right? These kinds of things. I thought about doing that. I the problem is that I normally like to actually like listen to this on my commutes. It's not a good time to take notes because I drive during my commute. But in any case, I'll just say there may be a better way to do this. but I want to present kind of this experiment that I'm hoping to run. Right. So first thing, for the story element, I want to suggest the story element, the way we can bring that in, I think most effectively without it intruding too much on the other elements, is to do some significant pre-planning in kind of GM mode. Right? After all, if you're the only player, you have to be, right, you have to control everything. Right? So you control the character, but you also control the world. So GM mode, think about the world. Right? So one of the most important elements here, and this is something that kind of is a lesson that I got from Sly Flourish, that is, as the game master, the thing that you control whenever you're running, and this is not just for a solo, but also for any group, you get to control how the session begins. What happens after that is largely out of your hands. It's going to come down to what your players decide to do and what do the dice do to them. Right? But that beginning is something that you get to decide. So think in GM mode and say, all right, if I want this narrative structure to happen, that means at this point in the narrative structure, we need to have an inciting incident. What does that inciting incident look like? And this is a good time for you if you like playing as a soloist and you don't want to like make this too predetermined. This is a good time for you to break out right the various oracles. Right, so use your random word generators or whatever it happens to be to get inspiration for what this inciting incident is going to look like. But do this before you actually start entering PC mode. Is the idea, so that it's not during the session when you're trying to immerse yourself you're having to make these narrative decisions, you make the narrative decisions ahead of time. Yeah. So that's kind of my thought, experimental thought on that. Also, it's a good idea to kind of pre-plan knowing what the goal is, right, for that session. Say, what would an appropriate session end look like? Not necessarily the resolution, but what kind of stuff has to happen, right? So what I need is some kind of inciting incident that is going to drive my PC to feel like they have to go on a quest. That kind of thing. We're not fleshing out the details here, but we know that once we hit to the point where the PC feels like they have to go on a quest, that's a good time to end it, because at that point I'm going to want to go deeper into GM mode. Right. So that's the idea. So plan for your GM mode. How are you going to begin things, and then when do you need to take a break to enter GM mode again in a significant way? A second element would be when you're in the session, trying to stay in the PC's point of view as much as possible. This allows us to get that immersive quality to it. And then finally, doing all of this necessitates, right, that we are going to minimize the mental space given to the system whenever we are right, there in session. And this is true, right, both of the game system and also of any oracles you're using, right? So sometimes you'll hear people that give advice say, well, you don't roll an oracle more than 3 times in a row or something like that. I don't think that's inherently problematic, but what is problematic is every time you roll in that oracle, you're taking yourself out of the mind of the character, right, and into the mind of the player, right, rolling the die and interpreting that die. Right? Or even in some sense the GM, right, rolling for that die, right? So minimizing die rolls in general, I think, does help us to stay in character mindset. So I think that that's kind of the purpose of that idea of minimizing the mental space. So use a familiar system, a relatively light system, and don't rely on it more than you have to, is the idea. Right, so I want to talk just a few seconds then kind of about channel plans that are related to some of this thinking that I've been going through. And that is one thing that I think I want to start doing here on this channel is intentionally integrating this overall approach of thinking about these three pieces of the mental space in solo RPG and how we can use them strategically, right? And then integrating that into the play that I do here on this channel. Right, so well, one of the way that I'm thinking about doing this is using kind of a shorter mini series, right, type of strategy for the games that I play. Right, so right now, if you look at the games that I'm in the middle of, I am in the middle of Dreadfair, though I haven't played that recently. But that game is one like it really doesn't have much narrative structure to it. It's more of me sitting down, sketching and chatting. It's not particularly. I don't really take on the role of my player or anything like that. It's really an excuse to draw, to be perfectly honest. But, but so I have that game. Another game that I have at the moment, at the time that I'm recording this, is the Story of Wilbur Orla in Cepheus Universal, using some of the solo tools from Zozer Games on that. Currently, we are doing a scouting mission, but that is one where I would say it has uh, a lot of system in that. Uh, so maybe some light immersive elements, and basically no story concern whatsoever. Right. So I'm thinking like that one. I may keep playing some, but I don't think I'm gonna do it as regularly as I have in the past. I think instead I'm going to be spending some time thinking about another, maybe a totally different system, but another game, and starting to try to approach it using this kind of experimental method that I've just talked about. And one thing, just kind of a detail here of how I'm thinking about maybe structuring a mini series. I've been thinking some about the three-act structure, and which is often used, say, in movies or in novels. Right? So I think that it has some potential, right? And there was a point in time, there was a Shadow Dark series that I ran, where I was trying to use the campaign structure that was suggested by Runehammer, who authored the ICRPG, for example. But one thing that I found was that as I was playing, I totally lost track of that structure. I did. I totally lost track of the structure as I played. Uh, and I think part of the reason was that it was that the series got kind of long, right? So it was easy for me to forget what I was doing. So I think maybe keeping the sessions somewhat more compact and focused is going to help with that. So rather than trying to feel out when we're moving into the next act, instead be very intentional and say we are going to do 8 sessions in a session zero. And be very clear about what is going to happen narratively in each of these sessions, even if we don't really know how things are going to resolve. And so I think that that is something that I can possibly bring in, right, and design around. So I've been thinking about doing that some. A lot of this is also inspired by the fact that I bought not too I want to say not too long ago, but the reality is it was probably like 3 4 months ago at this point. Um, a humble bundle that had a bunch of different systems in it. Now here I'm already going to violate a rule, and that I'm going to be doing systems that I'm not very familiar with. So, right, all right. So they're already just abandoning this experiment, right? At least one of the principles of it. But I want to try these new systems, right? And I kind of want to try them here on the channel. That's the idea. So I've already been experimenting some with Apocalypse World being, as far as I understand, the origin of the Powered by the Apocalypse system, which powers games like, from what I understand it, Avatar: The Last Airbender's RPG is based ultimately on that system, or things like Ironsworn. Ironsworn draws very heavily from Powered by the Apocalypse as a system. Also, games like Dungeon World being an obvious one. On this channel, I've played Monster of the Week, which is definitely Powered by the Apocalypse as well. But anyway, I have the second edition now of Apocalypse World as a PDF. So I've been thinking about, and I've kind of playing it off camera some to get a feel for the system. It's also one of those things where like once you get familiar with how Powered by the Apocalypse works, it's not that hard to move between the different systems, the specifics of them. Although it does take a little bit of I guess absorbing specifically how you deal with antagonists and failure and the like. Like one of the things in that was masks, and I like the idea of masks because I kind of enjoy the kind of CW like teen superhero shows, but the way that it handles antagonists conceptually is something that I find a little bit tricky to really get my head around. So that's something I'll need to do some more reading. So I'll just say I'm going to try to put, uh, create things more in very intentional, short arcs. I think this will also solve another problem in that the reality is that after 20 sessions, things start to get a little bit stale sometimes, especially for me. I mean, not for me as the player, but for Me as the creator, I am not that creative. So continuing to be creative in different ways for 20 sessions in a row with the same characters is just typically not going to happen for me. Let's be honest. But 8 sessions where each of them has fairly specific goals, that maybe I think that has potential. I think that has potential, right? So I think that's what I'm looking at. So I have here a link up on the screen. It's what is her name? I think it's Katrina Ostrander, if I remember right, who came up with this 8 session design here. It's the 3 act story structure for RPG scenario design. Unfortunately, Ostrander's original article I was not able to find. The link to it no longer works because it's to a website that I no longer maintain. But I do have the link here, which somebody that does work, I want to say it's Stephen Balagan, it's their website. And so if you just search for 3 act structure for RPG, you will find this website, and then I also have the link here. I will try to share it in the description of the video as well, if it's still live. And so the breakdown here is that it's 8 sessions plus a session zero, right, to get through the 3 acts, focusing heavily on that second act of rising action, with a couple sessions on either end for introduction and conclusion, with climax conclusion. And so I think I might be playing around with that in a bunch of different systems, and we'll see what happens. So, I mean, it's after all why we play. Okay, so thank you for watching, and this is Prof E signing off.